decided to shoot for the stars. Okay. So, got a couple of semi-local people, both Virginia area, Michael Blanc on the last one, and then, following up with the amazing Whitney Sewell this time around. So with that, Whitney, can you please say hello to everybody and go ahead and give everybody just a little bit of background on, where you come from and what you're doing now?
Awesome. Well, I am grateful to be here with each of you. It's amazing. Many of you I've seen before. We've met at a conference, or I've had you on the podcast even, one way or the other. We've met somewhere. But grateful for just to be able to speak with you tonight. I hope I can add value to you and help you in some way. I will. Brian, do you want me to just share, long story, or like get into it a little bit, or are you going to ask questions through it? How did you want to do that?
Let's do short story for now, and then we'll just do a conversation from here out. And then I already have a list of things that I know about you that I'd like you to bring up. So short story for now, and then we'll go, we'll dive in from there.
Yeah. You can give me, I guess, about 10 minutes and I'll share some stuff with you that'll be crucial to telling you how we've done what we've done. And then, I'd love to take questions or whatever, help you in just your specific way. Perfect. So, I will start with saying, over the last 2 years, we've closed in over $50 million in real estate. We have over 450 doors and interviewed over 600 people on our podcast. And that's less than 2 years. My network of industry leaders and investors have exploded. My drive and really, my drive and the success has got me speaking in front of lots of people, more than I ever imagined, honestly, and never dreamed of being able to do some of the things we've been doing. But I also got all these results while working full time. So, a lot of people don't know that I still work full time, and I put it out, and I don't plan to, but just a few more weeks. But ultimately, I like to tell people that because, it hasn't been easy. That's for sure. It has not been easy. It's been a massive grind, and we'll get into that. But it's something I had to commit to in a big way and, to make all that happen and for us to be where we're at now. But ultimately, in 2001, I also joined the military. Like many of you, I just knew it was the right thing to do. But of course, I had no idea that in just a few short months, our nation would be at war, and that I'd be spending a year of my life in Iraq, toting around a machine gun, praying every day I get to go home. Not everybody in my squad made it home, and so it was an experience, obviously, of a lifetime. But I'm thankful that the Lord allowed me to come safely home. So, but one thing that I appreciate from the military, and I say the military gave me, was a never give up mentality. It helped me to really change my mindset about, the obstacle in the way, and so not so much, having the thought of it being such a problem, but really thinking, just immediately changing that mindset to say, no, how are we going to get past that? What's that going to look like? Instead of thinking and focusing on the big problem ahead. But got home, tried to figure out what I was going to do. I didn't grow up around entrepreneurs or real estate investors. I had no idea that this was even a thing. Came home and from Iraq and tried to figure out what in the world am I going to do. And so, being a police officer was kind of like something that I had always thought about doing, and I enjoyed the uniform and the structure, all those things that the military had. And so out of 1,200 applicants, I was blessed to have one of 5 positions with Kentucky State Police. And obviously that never give up mentality still was so important. And it had to show from the way I wore my uniform to the way I responded to every dispatch. It was crucial. But I had an income problem. And, there were guys retiring that were making, less than $40,000 a year. Okay. And when I first got hired with state police, I would have done it for free. I loved working the road. I loved being in uniform, just the structure. I enjoyed the job. I wasn't married though. I'll add that. And, working nights and weekends, it wasn't a big deal. But finally, I realized that after getting married, the whole first year of marriage, we just passed each other in the hallway. And I realized it just wasn't what was best. And so I started looking what can supplement my income, or maybe eventually help me to leave, that job. And in came real estate. And I was exposed to real estate. That was in 2009. And I bought a couple of triplexes, and we made tons of mistakes. man, I mean, I can't believe, like looking back, like why the bank gave us money. I have no idea. Like what, what were they thinking, but anyway, they did, and we made it. We survived, but I learned a lot the hard way. As far as dealing with tenants and just all that, just lots of brain damage there, but it did turn into a university. That's for sure. So, we were there in 2009, and then I still had the income problem. Real estate, I'd only bought the 2 triplexes, and about the same time, I became a federal agent, and with the USDOT. And so my wife and I moved to Virginia. We live in Roanoke now. I think some of you may be in Northern Virginia or obviously in Maryland, and so you're not too far. You're not too far from me. So we love Roanoke. We've been here, about 9 years now. It's been an amazing place. But I've always had a passion since I was a little boy, though, for training horses. And I had like a second job, almost like the real estate's been. I was still doing a few small rentals, but I was also training horses nearly full time while also working full time as a federal agent. Okay. And so I would be in the arena training horses till midnight most nights, and on the weekends as well. And I share that with you because it's important, because maybe you're in the same shoes, where this was a passion of mine since I was a little boy. It was riding horses. And finally, at this point, it was just a few years ago, I was really good at it, honestly. But I spent tons of time on it. I mean, it wasn't just extremely natural, but it was like a passion since I was a little boy. And I share that because you've probably got something that you're passionate about as well. And maybe real estate's going to help you do that, do that thing you love to do. But ultimately, my wife and I bought a farm. I was training horses. I was doing clinics all over the country. I was training people, lots of people. I mean, I was doing clinics in front of hundreds of people, training horses and teaching them what to do, doing tricks. I'll stand up in a saddle and pop whips in both hands and have horses do tricks and have them laying down and all kinds of stuff. And so I never imagined being able to do those things, right? And I just want you to remember, this is a passion since I was really little. Okay. And I'm finally there, right? Finally, like, wow, like I never imagined being able to do these things. But it finally hit me that was never going to be passive. It was never going to be passive. I was always going to have to be the one training the horses. I was always going to be the one all the clients wanted training their horses. My interns, which I had some at the time, even like I said, I was still working full time. And I mean, I would do the Superman thing, change clothes as quick as I could when I got home and run out to the arena to train horses and give lessons and all kinds of stuff. But finally, my wife and I were at the beach one fall, and we just, we were praying and we were just walking together. And finally, the Lord just gave us peace about selling everything. So we said, you know what, if we really want to do this real estate thing and we know that that's going to be the best route, we just got to cut all this other stuff off. And that's why I tell you, like, this is a passion since I was a little boy. So, now I'm finally at this place, where like I'm almost known in the, horse training world like I am in the real estate now, not hardly to this level, but still, that's kind of where I wanted to be since I was a little boy. But my wife and I just knew that was never going to be passive, and it wasn't going to be what was best still, and that we had to just cut it off. So and at the same time, well, I'll tell you in a minute, but at the same time, I mean, we had lots of stuff going on, but we decided to sell the farm. We sold everything related to that business, everything. Okay. I knew that if I was going to be very focused on the syndication business, I couldn't have these other distractions. I didn't even want the option of taking other horses for training. And I just wanted to cut that off completely. So I just share that to say, you may have a passion as well that's almost holding you up for a little bit. And if you can see like the overall picture, if you can see, 3 years from now or 5 years from now, it may help you to put that on pause so you can really pursue something that's going to benefit you a lot bigger. And that's ultimately what I had to do. But like I said, we had owned numerous small rentals, but I was tired of looking for more tenants and toilets and just managing that on a day-to-day basis. Right. And I had up to like a 15 unit. And so I'd never heard of the syndication business. If you had told me that I could buy a 100-unit complex, I would have laughed at you. I mean, I would have literally laughed at you and said, no, I don't know who those guys are. I don't know, maybe 20 years from now, maybe I'll be there. I had no idea that was an option. And then I was introduced to syndication. I was introduced to lots of guys who were who were doing it. And I thought, wait a minute, if they can do it, guess what? I can do it too. And so I started traveling to conferences like mad. I mean, everyone I could go to all over the country. I was traveling all over the place. And networking as hard as I could go. And it was, I just met more and more people, more and more guys and gals who were building a syndication business, and they'd only been in it for a few years. They had not been in real estate for 30 years, and now they're finally buying that 200 unit complex, and so that just, it encouraged me a lot, right? If they can do it, I can do it too. And so soon, after hearing and meeting so many people in the business, soon obviously started raising capital, started networking, started meeting more investors, started building that database, on and on and on. Eventually started the daily podcast, right? Where now, like I said, I've interviewed over 600 people. That the podcast gave me, rapid credibility, gave me exposure, allowed me to meet so many industry experts. 600, right? In the last, less than 2 years. And so obviously just allows me to connect with so many investors, and allows me to have so much content now to add value to investors as well. It's done so many things, but it's became my own university, all right? I can ask all the experts any questions that I have. If I'm dealing with something in my business and I've got somebody on the show that I feel like may know the answer, guess what? I can ask them anything that I want. And that's been so valuable. But it also made me build teams. It made me to hire more people, and it made me build our business and build our brand a lot faster. And ultimately, because I committed to something that seemed almost so daunting, I didn't know if I could even make it happen. And so it made me do all that stuff from the beginning. Okay, and I'm not saying a daily podcast for everybody, because you almost have to be a little bit crazy, I think, to do it. So, but I look at it also as how fast do you want to get there?
Yeah.
Okay. How fast do you want to get there? And I, already had one example of a daily podcast, and he's doing pretty well, in a very short period of time. And I know Joe personally, but anyway, so, and I want to stress also, so at the same time we were in selling the farm, and I want to say, while we're excited about all this growth, there's something else that was happening then that helped us to push this growth. Okay. And so my wife and I, when we first moved to Roanoke, my wife and I were listening to a pastor talk about how they had adopted and how there are over 160 million orphans in the world. Okay. My wife and I had never discussed adopting before, ever. Not one time. And so on our way home, we just kept looking at ourselves and each other, and we just asked, why would we not adopt? Why would we not? We couldn't think of a good reason why we wouldn't bring a child home. And so within a week, we started the application process to adopt from Ethiopia. 2 years later, our first son comes home from Ethiopia. The next year, it was Samuel. And then the next year, Elijah came home through adoption. And then, and actually our daughter now came home. She was born in July of last year. So she's 10 months, right now 10 months old through adoption as well. So most people have no idea that adoption can cost $40,000 to $60,000. Okay. It's insane. So 160 million orphans in the world. There's so many families that would be great families, great parents, but that's more than most of them make in a year. And so they just shut it off right there. They won't even consider it. And so my wife and I are now on a mission to help families in that process that are in that position. And so that just fueled us that much more. Obviously, we had to be able to afford our own adoption processes, like selling the farm, doing all that. We want to be able to commit the syndication business, and we had started the adoption process again. But having that mission, having that why has been so important, and on numerous fronts. And I would say not just for me personally, but for my wife as well, our family. Because one thing that I underestimated, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this as well, because I think it's something that people don't think about, but is the sacrifice for the whole family. Okay. So I've been working full time, for forever, or since, I've been working but while also, the horse business, and that was like a second full-time job. And then I said, we just cut that off and I just turned the real estate up as much as I could go. And so, but it's been, like today, I've recorded 10 podcast interviews. I've had a couple other Zoom meetings like this, team meetings. And then I've also been interviewed on another podcast. And so, it's like extremely full days, right? And so it's how much can I get done? It's not uncommon for me to do 12 to 15 interviews in a day. And then, afternoons after work to do numerous phone calls and 3 to 5 interviews, numerous days a week. And so, but the sacrifice for the family, is something I think I underestimated. My boys ask me every time they see me, oh, when, are we going to play together? And I have to say, it's going to be a couple more days, before I'm going to be available while you're awake, ultimately. And so, but it's taken that level of commitment, to get where we're at and to make it happen. And then ultimately, to be able to say, okay, I'm going to leave the day job in about 6 to 8 weeks. And we'll obviously have a lot more time to do these things. Right. But ultimately the networking at the conferences and all that stuff also led to a partnership, which I also like to say is helped us to move forward in a big way. So it helped me to separate our tasks, right? Instead of me trying to do everything, searching for deals, networking with brokers, underwriting, all those things, raising capital, meeting with investors. Now, I've been able to split that and say, okay, you are doing this. It's, it doesn't mean that I'm not underwriting deals anymore, but guess what? That's your function. That's, right. You're doing that over here. Now I can focus more on, the investors specifically, or the podcast or the marketing or whatever that may be. Or, bigger things that I need, that I'm better at, and he can focus on better things that he's better at. And so, we met at a conference. I'd been asked by numerous people to partner on deals and to partner in general. And honestly had said no. But I was talking to this guy, or actually around a bunch of people around a table one night, and I heard this guy talking about his faith and his family and his success in syndication ultimately. But my wife and I had been praying for a partner for a long time, and he seemed to fit the bill. So we had a conversation, and I told him that this is what I was looking for. He seemed to fit the bill, and I'd like to further the conversation. And we were in Denver, and so he took me to the airport. He's from there, and we stopped by his house. This is like 10 p.m. at night, and we stopped by his house, and his wife has coffee and homemade bread when I get there. And so I knew it was meant to be. Right. So, but ultimately, we started down this path of really vetting each other and getting to know each other. I'm happy to elaborate on that more too, but there's a big process we went through to make sure this was a good decision and a good partnership moving forward. So, obviously we're just pushing to help other people adopt, and also pushing to grow the podcast, but ultimately our syndication business and help others along the way as well. So I'm happy to highlight any part of that you all have questions about. Happy to talk about it.
Well, a couple of things that you mentioned, and I think the biggest thing that I wanted to discuss was your work ethic. We met for the first time at a Michael Blanc event. It was probably about 18 months ago. And, I didn't know who you were at the time. I was brand new to myself, but started following you. And I noticed on your website, you had a link to set up a call. And I'm like, hey, maybe I will. And what surprised me is when I went to the website, the calls started at 5 a.m, and they went on till late in the night, which for me was actually perfect. I work at the Pentagon, so I leave my house at about 6, 6 every morning. And, some days I don't get home until 1800. That's the military. What's the regular way of saying that?
6 p.m. 6 p.m.
Yeah, 6 p.m. But, what I found amazing was, you were scheduling 5 a.m. calls, which, to me just kind of blew my mind, and the next thing, just the effort it takes to do a daily podcast, first of all, just, outstanding, your work ethic was evident from the very beginning. And, I'm sure that's been a big part of your success. Now here's a question. Now you say you were in law enforcement, with people retiring with $40,000 pensions. How difficult was it for you to raise money on your first syndication? And where was that in the process? Had you started your podcast already, or can you elaborate on that piece right there? Syndication, number one, where you were in life, and how you went ahead and went ahead to raise money on that.
Yeah, no, great question. Great question. So I had not started the podcast yet, but I had started going to conferences, and I had networked. I mean, as just hard as I can go to every conference. So when I go to a conference, I mean, I know my purpose. I know why I'm there, and it's not to meet as many people as possible, but it is to have as many meaningful conversations as I can. Okay. And so I try not to rush off from anyone. And so, I had to learn too, and I had to really focus on just focusing on who I'm speaking to. Okay. And I got to watch some mentors of mine, and they don't all even know they're mentors of mine, but just at a conference, when they're networking, I mean, they're like laser focused on this person, right? And I'll never forget that. It's probably been 3 years ago. I just remember watching, maybe longer than that now, but watching these guys that I really looked up to. And as they're at a conference, I mean, they're just laser focused on this person. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter if that person's never bought any real estate and they're trying to get to their first deal and this person has 10,000 units. This guy was just focused, and just giving them their undivided attention. So I'm like, you know what? I want to be like that. And so I just started trying to do that, right? And every conference we would go to, and I haven't always been good at that, and still not always, but that's my goal, is to really focus on that conversation. And ultimately, I want to remember that conversation enough to take a few notes, and I want to be able to follow up with that person and to give a, somewhat of a personalized email response to or follow up. And it's hard to do. It gets more difficult, but ultimately started conference, met another group that I partnered with to raise for the first deal. And so I had no idea what I would be able to raise, right? I mean, there's no way to know the first time unless you just ultimately know, have many family members that have millions of dollars, and I did not. And so none of my family's accredited. None of my friends are accredited. Like I said, I've never had, maybe this is a bad thing, I don't know, but I've never had any family or friends invest. And I think it's because they don't have $50,000.
I'm in the same boat. I mean, I'm definitely in the same boat.
So I had to, raising for that first deal, obviously you don't know, but I have been really working hard on those relationships and following up and meeting people, as many people as I could. So, I mean, it was a big faith thing. I just had to have faith that it was going to work. Went to all these conferences, right? And then partnered with a group who already had thousands and thousands of doors. Okay, already had the track record. And so ultimately, I don't know, most of you probably heard this before, but it's so true. It's like when an investor would ask me about my track record, I can say, well, the team I'm part of has, however many doors. And, and that helped me to get through those conversations a little bit when you're brand new and you have no track record and you've never bought a 200 unit property before. Okay.
Yeah.
So that was before a podcast though.
Okay. Now with your podcast, I mean, 600 interviews, once again, very, very commendable. I mean, I'd be happy to do 600 interviews in the next 10 years. And you've done it in about, less than 2, I think, if I'm looking at it right. How has that helped accelerate, your ability to raise money and your ability to syndicate in general?
Great question. It helps on so many fronts. It gives me so many mentors in the business that I didn't have before. All the people that are so far ahead of me, a lot of them, when you're first starting a podcast, and especially if they don't know you, they're not going to be on your show. If they've got their plate is so full. Okay, I'm experiencing it. I'm sure you are too. I mean, it's difficult, right? And so you're just not that priority, for them. If they've never heard of you, they've never heard of your show, it's going to be difficult to get them on. Okay. But what was your question? I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah. The question was, how it's accelerated, the process, especially with the money raising aspect.
So now I've got all these people that I can ask questions of, right? I've got all these people that I've added value to in some way. They may not give me 10 minutes of their time if I just emailed them and said out of the blue, like they didn't know who I am, and said, hey, would you give me 10 minutes? Would you talk? A lot of them would, because a lot of them are really great people. But many of them they couldn't do that for everybody. Right. But a lot of them will give you, 30, 40 minutes of their time to be interviewed on your podcast, especially after you have some downloads, you have some track record and things like that. And so, but as far as raising capital, so, you think if you're an investor, you don't know who I am, and then you go to the website, even if you never listened to any of the shows, but you see I've interviewed 600 people, I mean, there's instant credibility. Okay. Or maybe you look up somebody, that's a really big name in our industry, and you find them on the show, and guess what? My picture's there next to them. And so there's instant credibility, right? That
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're going to invest with me, but it does mean a lot. Okay. It does mean a lot. Another big thing is just the educational component. Now, speaking with investors, I mean, I'm so much more educated now than I was 2 years ago by interviewing all of these people. Okay. I would not have done these deals. I would not have raised as much capital now. I would not have partnered with my business partner now. If I hadn't have started the podcast.
Yeah. Now there's a question that I have on my list that just also popped up in the chat window. It's about daily routines, so what is your daily routine? For example, one of the books I like is Miracle Morning, Hal Elrod. What's your routine on a daily basis, and how do you manage your schedule, which is so incredibly busy at this point?
Great question. So I would say it's at least 3 or 4 years ago now. I also found that book by Hal Elrod, and I wouldn't say that I agree with 100% of everything in that book. However, that book helped me think through my morning. Like, what am I doing with my morning? And how important that time is. I had honestly not put enough thought into that. And so at that time, reading that book, ultimately, I started getting up early. And I wouldn't say that book has changed everything but by itself, but it did change my morning routine, which has allowed me to accomplish so much more. It's allowed me to just envision my day so much differently. It's allowed me to be able to get up in the morning and educate myself on other things. While I still have to work full time, I'm still able to educate myself and still able to get other things done. So ultimately in the mornings, I'm up, at this time I was getting up at 4:30 every morning. Okay. And now it's 5, but I'm sleeping in. So 4:30 every morning, but it was time, it's time for me to spend time with the Lord, time to pray, time to think about my day. And then also, it's time, it's precious time for my wife and I just to talk as well, which is so valuable, whether it's, if we have to talk about business at that time, or we're just talking about kids or whatever. And it's so important because guess what? For a long period of time now, I've been in the office till 10 p.m. a lot of nights through the week, right? And that's hard on the family. And so that morning time, it was very, very important. And so that time, but it also allowed me to read lots of other books that I would have never had the time to read, but I had to make that time very important. And like Brian, I had forgotten that you were one of the early ones, Brian, that got a call at 5 a.m.
It worked perfectly for me. I woke up 15 minutes earlier that day, and was able to get on the call pretty easy. Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. But I did. That's when I had to take calls, and so I would leave that time spot open for calls as well. And there are people that are like Brian said, they're going to work at that time, or they're coming home from work at that time, and it worked perfect for them. And so I just thought, why not open it up? I'm already going to be up. I'll just be available for calls at the same time. But that time, like you asked about schedule. So while working full time, it has been 5 a.m. to 7. I'm up and I'm doing those things I talked about. I also have bulletproof coffee. Does anybody know what bulletproof coffee is? So I have lots of butter and lots of raw milk in my coffee. But anyway,
is that the Tony Robbins? He spoke about that once.
I don't know if he does.
I heard him speak about putting lots of butter in his coffee too. I don't know, but not a coffee drinker. So.
But then ultimately, obviously then from 7 to 4:30, I have my day job. And then again, from 4:30 till 10 p.m., a lot of times I leave it open for either investor calls or interviews. And so that's why it's very common for me it'll just be a random mix of investor calls and interviews, podcast interviews, a lot of the days of the week. Okay. Yeah. And so we downsized in a big way. We moved into a small house in town, and that, there's not much for me to do here. I'm used to being on a farm. I'm used to being outside and working and doing those things. And so something that helped me that I didn't think about, is by selling the farm is, guess what? I'm so much more focused on having that farm again. Right. Yeah. I'm so much more focused, on having that, and us being able to move back out in the country again. And so you can relate that to whatever you're passionate about, but by getting rid of that. And that, it's helped me a lot because now there's nothing to do outside our house here. We live in town and now, so it's not as big a deal, just being in the office. So get home and then it's just, my appointments the rest of the day. Okay. But on, so I have a 3-day weekend every other weekend. So we work a little bit longer days at work. And then, so every other Monday is a regular day off, like today. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why on those long days, my assistant knows, and that's another thing we could always talk about, but I couldn't do this without a great team. But my assistant knows you better schedule, I mean, as many interviews as possible. Like I'll leave 15 spots open and they're just
Mm-hmm.
back to back to back to back to back. It's nonstop. And so, I mean, it's a marathon day, no joke, but you have to have the mindset that like, if that's what it takes, let's get it
Yep,
started.
got to get through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think Jerome asked the question about the podcast. I think that pretty much answers it. So is it true that you record most of your podcasts on Monday then?
It is. It is.
Okay.
I'll have two Mondays a month where I'll try to schedule 10 to 15 shows.
Okay.
You know, some days it's a bust, you know, I'll have 4 or 5 cancel, but I mean, I'll still get 8 or 9 shows done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so, but then a lot of them are done in the afternoons after work, say, you know, 4:30 to 8:30, something like that.
Okay. Nice. All right. Going through my list again. Another one from Jerome. How do you measure success of your podcast? You know, is there a metric you use for your own well-being to say this is my podcast is growing or my podcast is doing well?
Great question. And it's a hard one. It's a hard
Mm-hmm.
one to see the success and to keep motivated about it. And I tell people like plan to do it for at least a year, if not 2 years before you see any results. And I say that, and I hope people have results in
Mm-hmm.
4 to 6 months ultimately, but just in case you don't, you got to be willing. You got to be able to say, okay, I'm going to do it for a year or 18 months. Because when you get to 7 months or 8 months and you just really haven't seen much, you got to have the bigger vision in mind and just keep going. And so yes, we track downloads, we track, you know, lots of analytics. Like we have massive spreadsheets where we track all kinds of things, signups on the website and the contact us page, investors, and lots of things that we're tracking on a weekly basis. But for the podcast specifically, a lot of people say, well, has it been worth it? Has it been worth it to do a daily show? And I say, well, how fast do you want to get there? You know, how fast do you want to get there? And, you know, has it, you know, just made us tons of money? The podcast has cost me a fortune. Okay. You know, if you have a podcast, you know, it's probably costing you $100, $150 a show, maybe less depending on how you're producing it. But it depends on how much you're doing yourself and, you know, what kind of videoing and stuff like that you're doing too. But, you know, we're doing 30 a month. So you do the math, you know, it's cost a fortune.
Yeah.
Yes, we can get sponsors and we've had sponsors and stuff. But ultimately you got to be in it for the long haul and you got to be willing to, I mean, to measure it. Yes, we do. Like I said, we track downloads, we track it on a weekly basis. And it has been, there's been big spikes, you know, at times, and it's been helpful to be on other people's podcasts that have big followings and get to know those guys as well, have them on the show. Then obviously they share it with their followings. That's been very helpful with growing the podcast. But as far as, you know, would we be where we're at now without the podcast? Absolutely not. There's no way.
Nice.
And if it had been a weekly show, would we be where we're at? I would personally say absolutely not.
Probably not. Yeah. I mean, you're right. Getting on big people's podcasts. I mean, I've been on several, you know, and Michael Blank's the biggest one I was on. And, you know, I probably had, you know, 5 or 6 emails a day for, you know, the next 2 weeks just because of that one episode. So,
yeah,
that's a key. Now something a lot of times we talk about is you know, the first deal or getting to closing or finding or raising money. But there's also a big portion that happens after you close, which I don't think gets talked about very often. You mentioned you have a $50 million portfolio. Can you give us a couple of your keys to managing that $50 million? And that's what I understand. You've sponsored yourself, not the other deals that you've
that's right.
either co-sponsored or co-syndicated, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So if you would please just give some keys to managing a portfolio that large.
Team, no doubt about it. So if I hadn't had the podcast, I wouldn't have the business partner I have now. And ultimately he is my boots on the ground. And so I'm still working full time. He's full time in real estate. Okay. And so he's, you know, he lives about an hour from our assets. And so he's boots on the ground once or twice a week at least. And sometimes more often if needed. But the team, no doubt about it. I mean, I'm halfway across the country. Our properties are in Colorado Springs. And so, you know, obviously I'm there often, or well, it was probably once a quarter, something like that. but management has been, you know, for me, you know, obviously he's boots on the ground, then I'll be on a conference call or something like that. But, you know, that's his focus. That's his thing. And so, you know, obviously I'm watching numbers and we're talking about stuff almost daily, at least every other day. But ultimately that's his daily duty, you know, is managing those properties. Obviously we have an amazing property management company. They've been in the area since the early 90s. And so they've been crucial. You know, this past property we bought, 216 units. We closed like 2 days before the country shut down. And they actually managed this property for about 6 years, about 5 years ago, you know, for another group. And so just gave us amazing insight, you know, into the property, and especially as we're doing due diligence, and they've been incredible. So those two team members there, I couldn't do it without them. There's no way.
Okay. All right. So somebody on your own team who's running boots on the ground asset management, and you're saying is his full-time job right now is the asset management piece, and then property managers. Okay, that's absolutely key. And you know, I'll tell you one thing. You know, me getting to where we're at right now, and we've only got 88 units under our belt, but just the asset management of the 88 units was surprising at how much effort that actually took. You know, I think, like I said, a lot of people gloss over that part, but it's definitely, there's definitely a lot of effort involved as well. I'm going to dip into a couple of the questions in the chat room. This is from Leanne Kona. It says, what would you say to your younger self starting out in multifamily? And what would you focus on in the beginning that maybe you didn't focus on this time around?
Say it again. Where's that at? Maybe.
So, let's see. What would you say to your younger self starting out in multifamily? Let's just start with that question right there. He had a three-part question. Just hit the first part.
Yeah. What would I say to myself? This is going to be a massive commitment for your whole family.
Okay.
That's definitely something that I underestimated, and I'm thankful. And I don't know if I said it when I was talking in the beginning or not, but my wife she's really compassionate. She's very compassionate about adoption as well and helping others adopt. And so while she doesn't play a role in real estate, she plays a big role, you know, just in the support of me doing this. And so I think I underestimated that in the beginning. But I would also say, you know, go for it. You know, like don't, I mean, and I know you hear it all the time, you have to take action, you have to do these things, and you do. I meet people every day that call me to ask about podcasting or ask me about, you know, how to get started capital raising or whatever. And we'll talk, you know, we'll talk for 20, 30 minutes. But guess what? A year later, they've done nothing. And so, you know, I just encourage you, you know, you have to step out there. Yona's a good example of that. Hey, Yona.
You just popped in. Yep. Well, one of the most active social media guys I know, and I think he's probably, you know, grown his business tenfold just by his activity and his ability to do things. So
yeah, what was the next part of that?
The next part, I lost the question. I think you actually hit most of it. The one thing that you would have focused on in the very beginning, and you've already talked about that one. So Hutch, who is a podcaster, he just, like at the beginning we said he had hit his first 1,000 downloads. He's asking, how do you prep for each podcast episode?
It's a good question too. And so you have to think, if I'm doing this many shows and I'm doing that many back to back to back, I mean, that tells you how much time I have to prep, which is literally none. Okay.
Well, I would imagine that, you know, after 600, the prep time, you know, kind of goes down to very little. Let's rewind a year and a half and same question.
So the first day that I recorded interviews, I did 3 shows, and I think Yona may have been one of them. That's funny. So I think I did 3 shows that day, and I did spread them out, right? I mean, because I was nervous, and I wanted to have some time in between, and because I wanted to prep, and I wanted to maybe watch an interview of that person I'm going to have on the show where they've been interviewed before and learn a little more about them. You know, the next day I did 5. Okay, I did 5 interviews, and the next day I did 8. Okay, just 8 interviews back to back to back. And so ultimately, you know, I knew to be able to make this happen, I just don't have the time for that. Does that make the best podcast? Absolutely not. I'm not saying you should probably do it that way. If you have a weekly show, I would encourage you to spend some time learning about your guests. You're going to have better questions. You're going to know more about what their expertise is. You know, you're going to get better content out of them. And that's just not been a luxury that I've had to make this happen. And so ultimately I had to get really good at, okay, as soon as I get off the show with one person, so my assistant creates all my intros for me. the guests, we've automated this whole process now. So you can go to my website now on our podcast page, and you can click a button that says apply to be a guest. And that starts you in a big process, and you're going to upload your bio and your headshot. And, our team knows right where it is then. And so, you're going to get an intro that explains everything. Have a video. I've got a 2-minute video that tells the guests, what they need to know about the show and how to have their mic and all those things. It's so important. A lot of people won't listen to it, but there will be numerous people that will, because ultimately when I'm doing back-to-back shows, I don't have time to spend 10 minutes on your mic.
Right.
I'm sorry, I just don't, and so I try to prep you as much as I possibly can beforehand. All right. If I have to, I will, but that's not preferred. Right. So I'm trying to prep you as much as possible. So, but ultimately I'm reading that bio, and right before the show, I'm asking every guest, what's your superpower? What is your focus in the business? I'll say, is there some way that I can help bring out your expertise? What is that? Okay. And they might just fire off 1 or 2 things. A lot of guests will say, whatever you want to talk about. And that's the hardest interviews. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm like pulling for stuff. Okay. So even if you're going to be a guest, like give them something that you're going to talk about, like help them to help you be promoted well on their podcast. Right. And so I ask every guest that, and they tell me a few things. And so, obviously I read their bio and I know a little about them. Then we'll talk for a few minutes ahead of time. That's also another thing that I'll stress. That time with the guest, whether it's before or after your interview, is crucial. That's your networking time. That's almost the most important time of almost the whole podcast. Okay. When you're not recording. All right. That's when a lot of guests are going to share things with you they might not share on a podcast. That's where you're really going to get to know each other a little more. And you're going to be able to ask a few questions of that expert that, you finally got on your show. You're finally getting to meet face to face. Very important. But to answer your question about prep, I don't have time to do prep. My assistant does the interview, intros for me, and I have a certain format I want her to do that in, and then I just go right down through there. And I also keep notes. You got to keep notes, and so I keep notes as we're going, on that same form.
Yeah. A lot of good tips there. I mean, the guest preparation is probably just as important as your own personal one. Now, a couple of other questions, all related to your podcast. How do you choose sponsors and guests on your show?
Yeah. So sponsors, I try to find people that I would use their services, even if I'm not, at that time. But sponsors, finding sponsors is not always easy. But we've done some different marketing things, but we haven't pushed that extremely hard. Choosing them, like I said, it's going to be somebody that I agree with, at least ethically, or that I feel like they have a good business, or somebody that I would promote. And was it guests as well? How do we find guests?
Yeah, guests, correct.
So guests is a very difficult thing, especially to find 30 or more a month. Okay. So you can imagine, that's been a lot of time that we've spent, and not me personally, but, I've had numerous team members that have spent tons of time finding guests. And we've just recently we've revamped that process, and asking for referrals. And we even automated way now when my assistant may reach out to a previous guest and say, hey, would you mind to give us a few referrals for guests if you know some people. And there's even a form that they can click on this and open a form, and they can put email addresses in there, and those people will automatically get invitations to the show, and then, it's nice. So we've had to automate this because we're, doing so many interviews, and I've got to minimize that time because I'm paying so much for this assistant or whoever to just find guests. And so, in the beginning, obviously, if you're doing a real estate podcast, you can go to my website and find 600 people today. And their contact information. Hire you a VA at $6 an hour, and they can make you an amazing list of just all those people in their emails. That doesn't take very long. Joe Fairless has got 2,500 now. And so that's what we did. We went to Joe's show. We went to Michael Blanc's show. We went to guess what? Until we ran out. Of people that's in the syndication business. And now now I've done more interviews than those guys, except for Joe. And so. I've had to get creative. We've had to search out on Bigger Pockets, and we've searched out on LinkedIn, and we've, I've had to create some other processes and systems. And so I would do that, and I would lay it out, and then I would record myself doing it on my screen and send that to my assistant and say, this is what we're going to start doing. I'd go through it with her, then she would start doing that, building this list. I had another guy, I can't remember what country he was in, but he was really good at this. He's not doing it now, but he would just build lists of guests for me that he thought was qualified. And then, then I would try to vet them to some extent before we'd have them on the show. Nice.
Yeah. I can only imagine. 600, wow. Trying to come up with a list of 20 people, seems, daunting and insurmountable. insurmountable at times. Well, Whitney, I respect your time. We've been on the hook for 50 minutes now, so
I'm happy to keep going or answering questions or
okay.
whatever I can do to help.
All right, let's do one or two more questions and then wrap it up. One thing that we do want to do is virtual networking. And
yeah,
if we start that at 8, that'd be great. You're welcome to stay on. But got a question about podcast editing. What service do you use to edit it, or does somebody in-house edit it for you?
Great question. So I had a team of 4 VAs from all over the world that would do different parts of the show when we first started. So we did 170 shows, I think, that way. And so I had another assistant that was local that would help me manage all that. Okay. Mm-hmm. But then honestly, my audio editor couldn't keep up. So he'd done amazing up to that spot, but we got down to where he would only be a day or two ahead, and he was the first chain in the chain of events that had to happen to produce a show. And so you can imagine if we got a show coming out 2 days, from now, and he hasn't even edited the audio, we're crunching, right? And that puts everybody else in a bind. So I had to make a quick decision, and I found a podcast editing, company, and they do everything now, everything post interview. So my team finds a guest. Obviously I complete the interview, and then they do everything else as far as the podcast editing is concerned, video, audio, putting it on the website, and then I have another team that does social media and stuff. So I had to find a team that could keep up, honestly. They're not the only ones. I actually had another team, or he's not the only guy. I had another team that I hired that does this full time that couldn't keep up. And so I had to switch again, which is not my preferred way. I like sticking with somebody if they're good at it, but anyway.
Yeah, if they can't keep up, I mean, if you can do it, they should be able to keep up with you, right?
That was my thought. Like, you're doing this for a living. You should be able to keep up with me. Now,
I know we have several podcasters on here. Do you mind giving the name of the service that you're using now and happy with? Yeah,
We Edit Podcasts. It's who I use to do all that. Happy to give an intro. If you email me, I'm happy to give you an intro to the guy that owns the business.
Yeah, it's like the who's on first, Who's on first? Who? We Edit Podcasts. Okay, good enough. All right. So what do you need most from groups that you give talks to, present to like this? What are you looking for from groups like this?
What I need most, I need guests for the show, right? I need reviews. I need share the show. Obviously I would appreciate that. But yeah, I'm grateful to meet all of you, and I've just, like I said, I know a lot of you already. It's incredible to see how this works, and we just help each other here. Then I'll see Yona speak somewhere next week, and I'll learn something from him, or Jerome or Heath, or just numerous. It just happens over and over. So happy to add value to you guys. I am looking for like somebody that's really good at social media, or maybe even some video editing stuff. If anybody has some skills like that, interested in working on that a little bit. So, but yeah, that's obviously investors.
Obviously investors. Now, just my endorsement of this podcast, I wouldn't have them on the show if I didn't enjoy the podcast. So it is an amazing podcast. And the great thing about it is, with 600 guests, if you have a question, and I do this with Joe Fairless's podcast too, he's interviewed 600 guests. So if you have any questions on any single particular aspect of the syndication process, he's got it. So you can go to his website, you can go to Joe Fairless's website and just type in a couple of keywords and come up with several different episodes with different people on that one little topic. So, very, very good. Very good podcast. Something that I, in preparation for this, I think I binge listened to it. And also, several of the podcasts that you've been on, Whitney, with other people as well. But I just realized I usually give people 5-star, reviews, as soon as I reach out to them, and I realized I hadn't done that too. So I just tapped you a 5-star rating, and I'll give you a little review, later tonight once we're wrapped up here. But anyway, thanks a ton for coming on. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate everything you do. You know, something from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate, you know, your charity. The charitable cause that you have is definitely noteworthy. And I don't think you mentioned it, but you have several other places. You know, just for everybody else, Whitney gives 50% of the profits from Life Bridge Capital, your company, correct?
From me personally, yeah.
Okay, of your personal profits from Life Bridge. Okay.
Right, right.
Okay, to a charitable organization. You know, I thought I gave a lot. You know, I give 10%. You know, plus a little extra to my church, but you know, 50%. That's you know, astounding. You know, so very very commendatory. You know, I think you're doing great things. Love what you do and love who you are. How can people on this show reach out to you?
You're welcome to email me, Whitney@lifebridgecapital.com. Or you can also call or text me 540-585-4338.
Yep. And he just dropped that in the chat window for anybody everybody should be able to pull that up, so you don't have to scribble it down, you know, super quickly. You know, at this point, Whitney, you know, like I said, if you need to push, you can go ahead and push on. If you want to stay in network, you know, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'll stay a few minutes. Happy to help anybody that needs some help, but I can.
All right. So for the group now, what we're going to do is we're going to transition to, you know, smaller network groups. You know, I've done this a couple of times. I've done this with Michael Blanc's network, and I've done this, you know, a month ago with the last podcast, or excuse me, the last meetup that we did. But what we're going to do is divide everybody up into groups of 3 to 4, you know, depending on the numbers. We have 32 in the room right now. So we'll say groups of 3 to 4. And we'll give you about 12 to 15 minutes to talk. And, you know, one thing Whitney mentioned earlier is when you do stuff like this, you need to be laser focused. Okay, you need to know what you want to get going in. But a couple of things I'd recommend is, you know, take time to go around the circle, have everybody introduce themselves. Very short blurb on experience. But, you know, something I learned from another meetup in the area is just needs and wants. Okay, be continually, here's what I need, here's what I want, and here's what I can give, I think is the 3 things. You know, and who knows, maybe you'll find somebody that can fill one of your needs or wants, or maybe you can give something to fill somebody else's needs or wants. Incidentally, you know, Whitney found his partners in you know, meetups. I also found my partners at 4 Oaks Capital in venues just like this. So it may not be, you know, it may not be tonight, but, you know, if you're consistent, you keep on doing it, you keep on coming back to this and other events, eventually you're going to find that person that helps you take things to the next level. So without further ado, let's see if I can figure out how to, the breakout room. Oh my, I usually have this little breakout room thing at the bottom and it disappeared. So sorry about that. Give me a couple of minutes to see if I can figure this out. And
John, I'm happy to answer your question about VAs sometime as well. I've just seen that.
Thanks, Whitney. Do you want to keep up the Q&A while Brian is figuring out the breakout rooms, like you were saying?
Sure, I can talk about that for just a second while he does that. It says, do you train your VAs and assistants yourself or hire them from a service? I've done both. Most of mine I found through Upwork. I'm searching other platforms now. But yeah, I do train them myself. There's a whole hiring process we can talk about if we have time or whatever.
I had one question for you as well.
Sure.
Earlier, there was a question about the kind of metrics and measurements you use to measure the success of your podcast. I'm interested in how you measure or do analytics for your properties and investments themselves, because, you know, you can invest for cash flow, for appreciation. People are in different tax situations. How do you think about measuring the success of an investment given all those different facets of each one?
You mean like the specific property, how they're operating themselves?
Yeah, I guess for you choosing a property, or maybe for an investor who would invest with you, what they might find valuable, either one of those. Anything.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if I want to meet our projections, right? there's numerous KPIs that we are tracking on a weekly basis, and we'll get as granular as we can get. I mean, whether that's, how we're advertising and which types of advertising are producing the most traffic, and which properties are doing the best. Well, why is that happening? Which ones are advertising a certain way, or how are they showing a unit? Or we'll look at lots of different things, obviously occupancy and income and all those things that we're analyzing. But ultimately on a daily basis, we're trying to meet our business goals or our business plan, and that's communication with our management team, and on a weekly basis. And so we're tracking that on a weekly basis. And so also have like one of my assistants will pull out certain metrics and that we want to track specifically, that we want to talk about, that we want to ultimately go over with the management company. I mean, it's a lot of your basic things that you're going to know to track. But ultimately, it helps me to have better questions too, if I have those things ahead of time, and to talk about the management company about. As far as returns, or you ask like an investor invest, obviously 8% preferred return. We usually have a 70-30 split after that. And we want to double their money in 3 to 5 years, so we'll usually have around a 17 to 20% IRR. We're still trying to figure out right now what property is going to be worth next month,
Yeah, well,
so, like everybody else. So.
Yeah. I really like what you said about setting goals and then measuring your benchmarks to those goals that you've already set. I think that's really important. Got one more question from Dominic. I think this is an excellent question. He's asking if you can touch on the process of vetting your partners. You had a long process vetting the first partner that you took on, and presumably, the rest of your team as well as you took them on. How do you vet people and decide who to partner with?
Yeah, so that business partner was a very different type of partner than, say, an assistant or somebody like that, right? To some extent. So, my business partner, ultimately, I wanted to make sure he was one of the most trustworthy people I've ever met, honestly, before we were going to put rings on, because I treated it just like a marriage, ultimately. We met at that coffee shop that night, and I told him that he seemed to fit the bill, that he seemed to be what we'd been praying for, that he seemed to, he had the skill set that really complemented what I could do. He was a lot better at certain things, than I and me than him. And so what we did, though, over the next few months, we went into that night knowing that we're discussing partnering, okay, but knowing that it wasn't for sure going to happen. Okay. I made that very clear when I sat down with him. I just laid it out there. This is what I see in you. This is what I'm looking for. Are you interested in that? He was very interested. And so we had, after that point, he and his wife and me and my wife had numerous Zoom calls. We lived across the country. We had numerous Zoom calls where we would talk for 2 hours at a time, but knowing that we're asking each other any question we can think of. Okay. Anything, we just knew that, okay, to do this right, we're willing to share, we're willing to put stuff out there that maybe we wouldn't normally put out there, but I want to know who you are, right? I've worked too hard, spent too much money, too much time spent to grow my network, to build my investors' trust, to just partner with somebody and throw it away. Okay. So ultimately, and I even went back out there. I even went back out to Denver and stayed with he and his family for at least 3 days. And so that gave me a lot more insight, right? It allowed me to see him interact with his wife even. Guess what? The way he interacts with his wife, it may not mean how he's going to interact with me, I hope, but you know what I mean? How he treats her, how he treats his kids, that's important to me, right? Yeah. That's important to me. So those things were more important to me than that he's a walking calculator. That's what I call him. He's incredible with numbers and underwriting and structure. He's really talented. But that's great. But if I can't trust him like completely, then this means nothing to me. Okay. Yeah. And then assistants and, there's a whole nother level or a level under that, I would say. Like for a personal assistant's one thing, but then if you're hiring somebody to edit a podcast, that's a totally different thing, and I'm happy to talk about that sometime. But yeah, a whole hiring process of how we do that, or find that assistant that I'm going to do a credit and background check because they've got access to things that I wouldn't give to everybody. But then also hiring people for just one-off task types of things or repetitive things is different.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like the same kind of clarity and drive that's carried you to so much success in the rest of your business. Yeah. Well, looks like the breakout rooms are ready.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Usually I run things from my laptop. I logged in first from my phone, and so the menus were switched. Just took me about 30 seconds to get that switched back. But what you guys are going to see on your screen is a little box pop up that says join, and you just tap join, and it'll put you in a chat room lickety split. So
thank you all very much.
All right, thanks, Whitney. Appreciate everything. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Whitney.
Thank you, Whitney.
All right.